To give you a little bit of background of who we are, where we're coming from in delivering this live event. Both Joanna and I, we work for the Center for Community-Based Research, which is a nonprofit organization located on the University of Waterloo campus. We've been around since 1982, and we do a lot of different types of research, including with refugee newcomers. One of the projects that we have is called Evaluating Refugee Programs. It's a national IRCC funded project for 3 years. I see some of you online who are on our advisory committee, a national advisory committee that we have for this project. Its purpose is to equip groups across the country who support refugee newcomers in building their capacity to do evaluation. So we have a number of different capacity building resources that you can check out on our website there, evalforrefugee.ca, videos and webinars and mentorship, mentors and the like. And so this live event is one of the series of resources that we have, and which we'll post on our website, as Sherry mentioned, after this live event.
We are very excited about this opportunity to meet as a group and tackle the issue of ethics. Ethics are so important, and as all of us know, ethics are about minimizing risk, but also about maximizing benefits. And we very much wanted to spend some time to reflect on that. And we are suggesting an agenda that first will start with short reminding about why talk ethics, and a brief presentation by Ryan about principles in community-based research ethics, followed by presentation by Carol, who will shortly remind us about principles of trauma-informed practice when working with newcomers, especially refugees. Half of our meeting today will be designated to practical implications, and finally, all of us can mingle and talk together about really what it means in practical sense, and share and learn from each other about practical implications, practical strategies, and how to do research or evaluation in the best way for participants, for our organizations, and for everyone involved. So this is half of our meeting. We hope that we will all enjoy the 1 hour opportunity.
Thanks, Joanna. So we'll start maybe with really high level around why talk ethics, like why are we bothering having a live event about ethics? What is ethics? And as Joanna mentioned, really at its basic level, ethics is a consideration that we want to do no harm, both harm at the individual level for people within our communities, but also harm can be understood at a community-wide level. So that's some of the things that we'll be talking about later on in the webinar. It's not only a negative issue when we talk about ethics, there's also a positive element to it, and that's the maximizing benefits. Again, both at maximizing benefits for individuals who are involved in evaluation, as well as the benefit of the evaluation to the organization and the broader community. You can see here some key considerations that Ryan and Carl will unpack a little bit more. This is kind of organized a bit chronologically, like as people are invited to participate in research and evaluation, there's a whole consent process. So that concept of informed consent is central to ethics in research and evaluation. Both words, the informed, that they're aware of what's going on, the purpose and everything, and then given their awareness that they are informed, they consent and say yes, they want to participate. But throughout the research process, we need to be aware of ethical considerations and making sure that there is no harm and there are benefits maximized. And also, we'd like to also suggest that ethics is also about the use of evaluation information, that it's not just a learning opportunity, but part of the ethical practice is actually to live out some of the recommendations and the actions that come out of the evaluation, so how evaluation is used. So that's just a very basic overview. I think I'll turn it over to Ryan now to introduce himself a little bit and then to talk about ethics in a community-based setting.
Thanks, Rich. My name is Ryan Huckle. I am the past chair of the Community Research Ethics Office. I also work at Conestoga College in their engineering department, but I sit on the Conestoga College Research Ethics Board, so everything nicely dovetails together. I want to take a brief moment to talk about research ethics generally and how we CREO think through issues in community-based research. I'll talk at it from a little bit of a high level, and then I will get over to Carl to talk about it in terms of how best you can think through the processes in your own projects. And so by necessity, my presentation can't be comprehensive. I can't talk about every element of research ethics, but my goal here is to prime you and prime your thinking so that you can view the project through a research ethics lens, especially for community-based projects. And so for those of you who have done traditional research at an institutional level, such as universities, colleges, hospitals, and the like, you might already be familiar with the research ethics review process. And I see in the participants list there, I recognize some names of some of the past applicants for our project or our organization. And so I'm happy to see it. But for those of you who aren't as familiar with it, the Community Research Ethics Office is set up to be a research ethics board, similar to what you would see at a hospital or a university or a college, where we take the TCPS2, which I'll talk about in a moment, and apply the principles from that document, and we review projects that come to us from the community. It was seen that there was a gap in the community where organizations, entities, individual researchers didn't have access to the institutions. And so our organization was set up to provide a system and assistance with those kinds of projects. And so we have developed some tools and strategies for reviewing projects, but everything that we do is informed by the TCPS2, the Tri-Council's policy statement on the ethical conduct involving humans. And so while we aren't saying that we are the experts when it comes to research ethics, and we are certainly not going to be the foremost experts about community-based research as it applies perhaps to your individual projects, we are taking this national document, the Tri-Council policy statement, and applying it with a community-based research mindset to the process. And so what does it look like to actually go through the ethics review process? We will take a look at things like a project's methodology, the risks and benefits. We'll look at how you recruit, how you try to bring people from the community into your project. We'll look at the consent process, which we talked about in a previous slide a little bit. We'll also look at things like data protection and privacy and how you go about securing the data as you collect it and what you intend to do with the data. And we do this all through the lens or through a framework of what is the impact on the individuals and community. The traditional research ethics review process looks more at the individuals. And so if you're used to an institutional setting, there's more primacy given towards the individuals. But what we try to do is we try to take the good ideas from community-based research and apply that lens of how does the research intersect with the community. And so why is this important, you might be asking? I mean, everyone's concerned about ethics, but why is this important to you? Well, I think there's two threads here that we're trying to manage. On the one side, I do believe firmly that researchers are good, genuine, and honest people, that you will never try to set out to intentionally harm persons or harm communities. But researchers are also motivated by, among other things, a desire to understand the world a little bit better and translate that into the broader good. But there are some incentives in there, especially in academics, where you're incentivized to publish and make sure that you're on track for certain milestones. And there's this second thread that tends to creep in there, and that we are bound up in our ways of knowing and our incentive structures. And so historically speaking, this is translated into abuses of power and harms to both individuals and communities alike. And so therefore, over time, these principles of research ethics have been articulated and documented, and these processes of review have been set up and developed so that we can understand research, its impact, and protect the research participants, both at the individual level and at the community level. And so on the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about a brief overview of our principles that we use to review and inform the review of the project itself. So I'm not going to go through the individual components of this. You can find this on our website, and you can certainly contact us if you'd like a PDF copy of it. But there are three, going from left to right, three principles that come out of the TCPS. This is the respect for persons, a concern for welfare, and a concern for justice. And we at CREO have added, or at least clarified, the idea of respect for community. Because arguably speaking, respect for community is built into the other three sections. Especially, this has come out in the Western research framework being updated and informed by Indigenous scholarship, that you can't necessarily always separate the individual from the community. And so what we want to do from the TCPS is pull out those good ideas and apply them to the community as well. And so the respect for persons is largely recognizing the intrinsic value of a human being. It is a respect for their autonomy, and it's a respect that is informed on an ongoing basis, which can reflect the idea that people can have different capacities of consent over time. So it's not a one and done thing just because somebody consents initially, that you explain to them that that is always going to be how it is. It's an ongoing informed process. And that informed part is key. And it's the ability for you to explain a project, to inform them of the methodologies of the project, the purpose of the project, the benefits and the risks, so that they can self-determine and they can choose for themselves whether to participate that is free from coercion. And so you have to be mindful of those power imbalances and what happens with the researcher participant perspective. First and foremost, there's a respect for the persons, the individual themselves. But then there's also, beyond respecting the individual, you want to have a concern for welfare. And this relates to the quality of a person's lived experiences. And this can include things like the physical, mental, spiritual life of the person, but it's also a little bit more broad in terms of economic, social, community-based welfare, their standing within the community, reputational aspects, housing, and the dignity of being a person in the community, as well as their privacy. And so this relates to you as a researcher balancing the benefits from the research against the probabilities and magnitudes of potential harm. And that is real and perceived harm. You know, just as a example of this, when we talk about harms, often we think about physical harm, of whether or not somebody will be physically injured in participating in research, like electric shocks or asking them to put their hands in cold water. But oftentimes we don't consider other kinds of harm, such as psychological harm, of talking about past traumatic experiences, that when you ask them to share their story, you run the risk of creating real harm if you're not careful with how you go about collecting your data. Research is also inherently risky, and it pushes the boundaries of knowledge, and therefore researchers must account and anticipate issues about welfare. And the aim isn't necessarily to remove all risk. Like I said, research pushes the boundaries of knowledge. There's always risk inherent to that. So it might not be possible to remove all risk, but instead you want to identify the unnecessary risks and provide a full opportunity for full informed consent that most favorably balances those risks and benefits. And for the concerns of justice, it's all about treating people fairly and equitably, distributing the benefits and the burdens of research so that no one segment is unduly burdened or denied the benefits of research. And remember, this doesn't mean that equity is the same thing as equality. Sometimes there are differences that must be accounted for. And I'll just read a quote here. Differences or distribution are justified when failure to take differences into account may result in the creation or reinforcement of inequality. And so it's the idea of approaching it on a case-by-case basis and breaking down those barriers to research. It also relates to the vulnerability, in which context and circumstances can inform when people are vulnerable. Not everyone is vulnerable at the same times in the same circumstances. The participation is based on your inclusion criteria, which is justified by your research. And ultimately, justice is threatened by power imbalances, so taking those into consideration. So those are the three main ones from the Tri-Council policy statement. And then we have articulated it at a community base that communities have self-determination and that they have the right to self-determine their own welfare and their own story, that you recognize that communities aren't all the same or that they don't have the same concerns in history. And so you can't treat all communities alike, that you want to guard against the community shouldering the burdens of the research for the benefits of somebody outside of the community. That's not to say that what happens within the community can't be a good idea that's spread to other communities, but you have to remember that who is shouldering that burden and how you're going to handle it. It's about protecting the community against further stigma and further harm and not perpetuating those harms. And it's important that the researcher understands that the community has its own needs, and that traditional Western research is usually that the researcher is an outsider that parachutes into the community. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing on the face of it, but the researcher needs to decentralize themselves from the process. The researcher has expertise and they have resources for the project, but they don't necessarily own and control the process and the data. So it's the researcher out of the center of the project and moving them off to the side as an ally. And so these are high-level principles that are used by researchers to help guide and develop a project. But as many of you are familiar with, that policy documents can sometimes not provide a sufficient amount of guidance on how the values gets interpreted on specific case-by-case examples. So a research project that involves 20-something-year-old university students is by necessity vastly different than one aiming at addressing issues within a community such as Indigenous peoples or refugee populations. And so therefore, I'm going to now hand it off to Carl, who can discuss some more specific concerns with research in the refugee populations.
Thank you very much. That was very informative for me as well. I will spend a couple of minutes just telling you a little bit about Reception House. You can see what our mission is. As an organization, we have been in the KW community for almost 35 years. Our focus is really serving government-assisted refugees, but we provide services to other kinds of refugees over the course of the year. We spend a great deal of time thinking about providing enhanced services to the people we serve. And sometimes in order to do that, we have to sort of partner with other organizations to help us evaluate, do some research on sort of best practices and principles. And as an organization, we focus a lot of our work, especially in the first year, on providing sort of case management support to those people who come into the community. So sort of the journey of refugees typically are, many of those people are in refugee camps. They here been applying to find a country that will accept them. Sometimes they know quite a bit of time ahead. Sometimes they know for about a month or a week, or sometimes it's a few days. They're put on a plane and they are flown to Canada. They land at Pearson International Airport, and there is a process, there's an organization that works with those folks who land at the airport, provide orientation, they provide documentation. They're put on a shuttle and they head to Kitchener-Waterloo. And we are the organization that receives them. We have temporary accommodations that we use to house people, typically for 2 weeks. Sometimes it's a lot longer. During the pandemic, we have been using hotels as the quarantine, the 14-day quarantine. And then after they've finished that quarantine, they come to our temporary accommodations. And part of our work is to help them find permanent housing and then help them settle. And that's a very, big term in terms of what settlement means. We use a trauma-informed lens to do our work. We don't say it every day, but I think in terms of the principles of that, we look at safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. Those are some of the practice that we view. Many of the people that end up at reception house have themselves gone through a whole lot of trauma, so we don't want them to relive that trauma. 99% of them come from refugee camps. Some people as long as 7-8 years in a camp. So they're coming into an environment where they are very vulnerable. They are suspicious of governments. They sometimes have expectations that are very unrealistic. So they hear they're coming to Canada and they believe that this is a land that is going to provide a whole lot of services and opportunities for them. And sometimes the expectations are greater than the reality. So I think people view us as protective of the people we serve, but at the same time, we want to ensure that they're empowered to help make their own decisions as they kind of traverse their settlement journey in Canada. Our case management function focuses on helping people to meet very diverse needs that they have. As an example, probably 1/3 of the refugees that come into our community have themselves or some member of their family have some kind of a medical issue. So it could be a child with a disability. It could be a parent with some kind of illness. And so part of the very first things that we do is we work in partnerships with the Center for Family Medicine, and medical assessment is the sort of fundamental piece that we start with. And that is a part that helps people to start to understand and to trust what we're doing, so that they can see that at the very beginning that they're being helped with a very urgent need. And that helps them to start to sort of build trust within the family for the work that we do. Our case managers are, we have a very diverse group of case managers from themselves have had experience in other countries. Some of them have been refugees as well. We speak about 33 languages as a staff team, and we also work with other organizations in the community that provides interpretation services. So that is a big piece of the work. When people start to talk about research, we want to ensure that the people that we serve understand what is happening to them. So sometimes that means a lot of education to those people so that they can make the decision. We don't say you have to do this. We say this is what is happening. We give people as much information in their mother tongue as we can, so that they can make their own decisions about participating. As an example, we have just been involved in some research by the federal government, and we put the word out to a number of people in terms of what we were looking for and what the government was looking to do in terms of some of the research that they were looking at, trying to get a sense of the journey of refugees from the camp to a reception house, and how they feel about that journey, and what parts were easy, what parts were difficult, what parts did the government make it easier for them, or what parts were more challenging. And so we put the word out to our community, and we then spent some time kind of educating people generally about the research, and then people chose to participate or not to participate. That's part of, again, when we build trust and we build the connection with the people that we serve, we allow them to sort of make their own decisions. And because the work that we do generally are with families, and we do it for typically 1 year, and during that year, a whole lot of stuff happens. Not only language assessment to determine where people's language skills are, but we connect people to other services in the community. So we act as kind of a guide to get people connected to other services, because we can't provide all the services that people are going to need. It's very important that as people think about research, and over the last few years, especially during the year or so during Operation Syria, there were so many researchers that were local, were from other parts of the country, even from outside of Canada, that were calling us and wanting to engage clients in research. We kind of acted as a gatekeeper. We were really focused on, especially in the very early days, ensuring that people were at least partially settled before we could say, okay, there are some folks that want to do some research. Are you willing to do that? We were the gatekeeper, and I think that we had some challenges with some researchers because they felt it was their right to be able to be involved in research, and we thought it was our right to determine how they connected to our organization and how they dealt with the folks that we basically serve. And so the first little while, there was a lot of discussion about what we should do as an organization, and we kind of set up a bit of a process to ensure that people were protected. I think it's very important for us. We've worked a lot over the years with CCBR, and we ensure that when we enter into any kind of engagement, that the framework is done in such a way that the folks that we serve are front and center, that they are understood, that the supports are there for them so that they're comfortable in sharing their information. Again, as someone said, we don't want to re-traumatize anyone, and we want to ensure that, in fact, the results of the research make sense for us as well as make sense for the researcher. I think that my last comment would be that as people think about research and think about the people who are at the center of the research, that they think about not only the ethics that was described by Ryan, but they think about sort of, where those people might be in their settlement journey, especially when you're dealing with refugees, because some people are able to settle within a few months. Some people, it takes them many years. And when people are experiencing trauma, and if they're experiencing any kind of mental health issues, sometimes they don't show up right away. And talking about those issues, or just being in a circumstance that kind of helps, that makes them relive that experience, sometimes can be very damaging. So we want people to always think of those things as they approach wanting to do research that in the long run will be beneficial for everyone, but in the short term must be really focused on ensuring the safety of the people that they are looking to do the research with. Thank you, Rich.
Well, thank you, Carl, and thank you, Ryan. You've given us a good overview Ryan, generally about community-based research and ethics, and Carl situating specifically more in the when researching and evaluating with refugee newcomers. If you notice, the common word across their presentations was principles. And in Canada, we often think about ethics in a principle-based way. Different a little bit from some of the research done in the United States, which is more procedurally based way, where you have certain scenarios that are kind of laid out and you need to respond in these kinds of ways. In Canada, we tend to hold these principles and then look on the unique cases that come before us in specific evaluations and research projects, and then we grapple with how do we apply these principles within our particular studies. So these principles of community-based research ethics, and these principles, in this case, of being trauma-informed in evaluation. So what we want to do next is dive a little bit deeper into those specific cases that we collectively, those of us who are together on this Zoom call, may want to bring to the fore. And we're doing this webinar a little bit different. If you've joined our other webinars, it was a more standard way of having some questions through the chat line and then people responding to it. We're thinking of doing this a bit more interactive, and Sherry will in a moment break us out into 2 or 3 breakout rooms. And these are the questions we thought that we would talk about based on your own experiences and the different contexts that you come from. What are some of the ethical challenges that you have or anticipate that you will face when evaluating with refugee newcomers? Maybe you have some experience and want to offer some strategies or ways of responding to those challenges to minimize risk and to maximize benefits. And then there might be also some discussion around the unique situation that we are in with the current pandemic, and what are the implications of these principles